Helen Grant lived quietly in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Cedarville, a sleepy town nestled in the endless cornfields of Iowa. From the outside, her life seemed simple, almost invisible. She was the woman who kept to herself, who wore the same worn-out cardigan year-round, who sold homemade pies at the local farmer's market every Saturday morning. Few knew and fewer still remembered that Helen had once been someone else entirely, a respected CFO at a prestigious firm in New York City, living a life of tailored suits, endless board meetings, and glittering galas. All of that had vanished in a single night, nearly 20 years ago, when a car accident on the icy highways of Connecticut had taken from her both her husband, Richard, and their only son, Jacob. The call had come at 2 a.m, the voice on the other end clinical, detached. There had been no survivors. In the weeks that followed, Helen had sold everything: the apartment, the car, the jewelry. She transferred her remaining savings into an anonymous trust and disappeared from the world she once ruled. She chose Cedarville not for its beauty but for its obscurity. It was the kind of place where no one asked too many questions, where a widow could tend a garden, sew quilts, and slowly stitch her shattered heart back together without attracting attention. Life settled into a pattern, each day bleeding quietly into the next. Helen's world grew smaller, safer, wrapped in the routines she had crafted like a cocoon.
Until one rainy night, everything changed.
It was early November. The harvest had been brought in, and the wind carried the scent of wet leaves and distant bonfires. Helen was returning from the farmer's market, her old pickup truck rattling over the pothole-laden road. As she passed the small dilapidated church that sat on the edge of town, something caught her eye: a small figure huddled on the cracked stone steps, soaked to the bone. Helen pulled over instinctively. Heart pounding, she approached cautiously, the rain soaking through her thin jacket. The figure was a boy, no more than 5 years old. His hair clung to his forehead, his clothes were threadbare and dripping. He looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, his tiny body shivering uncontrollably. "Hey there," Helen said softly, crouching down to his level.
"Are you lost, sweetheart?" The boy said nothing.
He only stared, as if weighing whether or not to trust this stranger. After a moment, he nodded almost imperceptibly. Helen didn't ask any more questions. She peeled off her jacket and wrapped it around his trembling frame, lifting him into her arms. The boy was light, frighteningly so, as if he hadn't eaten properly in days. She carried him to her truck, cranked up the heat, and drove straight to the Cedarville clinic. The doctor on call, an old friend named Martha, gave her a grim look after examining the child. "Severely malnourished. Dehydrated.
Hypothermique.
He's lucky you found him when you did." Helen stayed by his bedside all night, holding his tiny hand as he slept. No parents came looking. No missing child reports matched his description. He was a ghost child, abandoned, forgotten. By morning, Helen had made a decision. It wasn't something she debated or rationalized. It was something she knew, in the deepest part of her soul. She would not let this boy slip back into the darkness he had emerged from. She named him Michael. The adoption process was surprisingly uncomplicated. Perhaps it was the size of Cedarville, or perhaps it was the quiet authority Helen still carried despite her worn clothes and simple life. Within months, Michael was legally her son. At first, Michael was wary, like a wild animal unused to kindness. He flinched at sudden movements, hoarded food under his pillow, cried silently at night. Helen didn't push him. She simply stayed close, offering steady, unconditional presence. Slowly, Michael began to trust her. He followed her around the house, mimicking her movements. He learned to bake pies, to plant tomatoes, to thread a needle. His laughter, when it finally came, was a brittle, beautiful thing that made Helen's chest ache with a bittersweet joy. She watched him grow with a fierce, tender pride. Every scraped knee she bandaged, every school recital she clapped for, every bad dream she soothed, they stitched new life into her own broken soul. Yet, Helen never told Michael the truth about her past. In her mind, there was no need. She wasn't the woman she had once been. That life was gone, buried with Richard and Jacob. She was simply Mom now, not CFO Helen Grant, but just Mom, the lady who smelled like cinnamon and garden soil, whose hands were rough from work but always gentle when they touched him. She kept her wealth hidden. The trust fund remained untouched except for emergencies. She lived simply, frugally, teaching Michael the values she held dear: kindness, hard work, gratitude. And for a time, it was enough. Michael thrived. He was bright, compassionate, eager to please. His teachers adored him. His classmates flocked to him. He spoke often of dreams, becoming a doctor, helping people like Dr. Martha who had once helped him. Helen listened to these dreams with a quiet, swelling pride. She would do anything to help him achieve them. Anything. Even if it meant, once again, giving everything she had, and everything she was, to someone she loved. She didn't regret it. Not for a second. But life, Helen knew too well, had a way of changing even the best-laid dreams. And sometimes, love given freely became a weight too heavy for those who never learned its true cost. Life with Michael settled into a gentle rhythm, a steady heartbeat against the quiet pulse of Cedarville. Helen's world now revolved around the boy she had rescued from the rain. She woke each morning with a purpose, packing his lunch for school, mending his clothes when they tore, baking extra pies to sell so she could afford his books and soccer cleats. Every dollar was stretched until it screamed. Yet Helen never once considered it a burden. In her eyes, Michael was a gift, a second chance perhaps, at a motherhood cruelly stolen from her years ago. The people of Cedarville, accustomed to Helen's reclusive nature, gradually came to accept the boy with the messy brown hair and serious eyes. Some whispered, some speculated. Was he a distant relative? A charity case? Helen never explained, and over time, they stopped asking. Michael grew quickly, sprouting up like the cornfields that surrounded the town. He was bright, curious, endlessly kind. Teachers praised his manners, his diligence. Helen would sit through every parent-teacher meeting, beaming quietly as she clutched Michael's report cards to her chest. They had little in the way of luxury. Christmas presents were handmade scarves or second-hand bicycles. Vacations were afternoons spent fishing at the creek or picnicking in the town park. Yet Helen built a childhood for Michael stitched from laughter, trust, and the solid, unwavering presence of someone who would never abandon him. Money was tight. Helen had carefully kept her fortune untouched, locked away in the anonymous trust fund established long ago in New York. She lived solely off the meager earnings from her baked goods, odd sewing jobs, and occasional farmhand work. Neighbors often shook their heads at her frugality, pitying the woman who seemed too proud to accept help. No one knew she could have bought the entire town if she wanted. Helen preferred it that way. She wanted Michael to grow up understanding the value of hard work, of honesty, of earning one's place in the world without shortcuts or entitlement. As the years passed, the seasons turned, and Michael blossomed. He loved science, devoured books about medicine and the human body. He talked often of becoming a doctor, of working in underserved communities, helping children like he once had been. Helen listened, her heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. Richard and Jacob would have loved Michael, she thought. In many ways, Michael was the continuation of the life that had been so brutally cut short. And yet, there were moments, quiet, fleeting, when Helen felt a pang of fear. Michael was growing older. The town was growing smaller for him. His ambitions were too large for the narrow lanes and fading storefronts of Cedarville. Helen knew, someday soon, he would leave. And she would have to let him. When Michael was 16, he got his first job at the local diner, washing dishes after school. He saved every tip, determined to contribute to his college fund. Helen matched every dollar he saved with money carefully hidden in envelopes tucked beneath the floorboards. When he turned 17, Helen took him to the city an hour away to buy his first car, an ancient Ford pickup with more rust than paint. Michael treated it like a Ferrari, washing it every weekend, driving it carefully down the gravel roads. High school flew by in a blur of late-night studying, football games, science fairs, and long talks between mother and son at the kitchen table over hot cocoa. Then came the day that changed everything. The letter arrived in a crisp white envelope bearing the emblem of the University of Chicago.
Hélène stod in the doorway, at am ring, a Michael riped it open, I sans trembling.
He read the first few lines and then whooped with joy, spinning Helen around the kitchen in a dizzying dance. Full scholarship.
Prémed programme.
Helen cried that night, silent tears that soaked her pillow. She was proud, so proud she thought her chest might burst. But beneath the pride was a gnawing, aching fear, the fear of being left behind again. She said nothing of her worries. She smiled, baked Michael's favorite apple pie, and helped him fill out financial aid forms. Together, they drove to Chicago that summer, a battered pickup truck loaded with boxes and dreams.
The city skyline rose like a wall of glass and steel, shimmering under the July sun. The campus was vast, intimidating, beautiful.
Students hurried past in clumps, their faces alight with ambition. Michael's eyes shone with excitement, drinking in the energy, the possibilities. Helen stayed only long enough to help him set up his tiny dorm room, a simple bed, a second-hand desk, a bulletin board for photos she insisted he take. She handed him a small package before she left, a hand-stitched quilt she had worked on in secret for months. Each square was a memory, a fishing trip, a birthday party, the first day of school. Michael hugged her tightly, murmuring words of thanks. Helen lingered at the door, reluctant to step away. She wanted to tell him so many things, about love, about loss, about the sacrifices he would never see. But she said only,
Be good, Michael.
Be kind. And then she turned and walked away, her shoulders straight, her steps steady. She didn't look back. If she had, she might have seen Michael watching her from the window, a strange, conflicted expression on his face. Life in Cedarville became even quieter without him. Helen continued to bake, to sew, to tend her small garden. She volunteered at the church, taught quilting classes at the community center. But every evening, she sat by the old rotary phone in the kitchen, willing it to ring. Sometimes it did. Michael would call, his voice rushed, telling her about lectures, exams, new friends. Helen listened, soaking in every detail, clinging to the sound of his voice like a lifeline. Other times, days stretched into weeks with no word. Helen told herself it was normal. He was busy. He was young. He was living the life she had always wanted for him. Still, a quiet loneliness settled into her bones, as steady and inevitable as the setting sun. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of unease began to take root, a tiny whispering fear that the world she had built with so much love was slowly slipping away. Michael thrived in Chicago. The city, with its ceaseless energy and endless opportunity, seemed to awaken something in him that Cedarville never could. His professors praised his sharp mind, his determination, his easy charm. He found a part-time job in a lab, started attending networking events, and quickly built a circle of ambitious, driven friends. Helen listened to his stories during their rare phone calls, marveling at how he seemed to belong so easily to a world that had once felt so distant and unreachable to her. A part of her swelled with pride. Another part, the quieter, sadder part, tightened with fear. He was changing. Not in ways that were immediately visible, but in ways that Helen, in her infinite maternal instinct, sensed beneath the surface. His voice, once eager to share every detail of his day, became brisk, distracted. Calls grew shorter, less frequent. Visits home dwindled to quick weekends, then to hurried stopovers, then to none at all. Helen told herself it was natural. All children grew up, grew away. She had raised Michael to be independent, to chase his dreams beyond the cornfields and quiet nights of Cedarville. This distance, this silence, was the price of success.
Sti, it hurt.
The real fracture came in Michael's second year, when he met Emily Carter. Helen first heard about Emily during a rushed phone call in February. Michael mentioned her casually, almost offhandedly. She's in finance, he said.
Real smart.
Dad would have liked her. Helen caught the slight hesitation before he said Dad. It was the first time in years Michael had referred to Richard, the man whose photo still sat in a dusty frame by Helen's bedside. She sounds wonderful, Helen said warmly, pushing aside the unease curling in her chest. Yeah, Michael replied, but his tone was clipped, distracted.
Listen, Mom, I gotta run.
Talk later, okay? Click. The line went dead. Helen sat for a long moment, the hum of the disconnected line buzzing in her ear. She had no face to attach to the name Emily Carter, but in that instant, Helen knew, someone new had taken root in Michael's life, and she, the woman who had once been his entire world, was being pushed further to the margins. Months passed. Michael spoke less and less about his studies, more about plans for the future, big plans.
A condo downtown.
A prestigious residency. Connections through Emily's family. His words became peppered with phrases Helen had rarely heard from him before: networking, social capital, positioning. The world he now inhabited was one of polished surfaces, of handshakes and strategic smiles, of status measured not in kindness but in capital. Helen listened, nodded, encouraged. That was her role, she reminded herself.
Support, never burden. Give, never demand.
It was during the Christmas break of Michael's junior year that Helen finally met Emily. They had arranged a dinner at a sleek new restaurant in downtown Chicago. Helen arrived early, clutching a homemade tin of her famous snickerdoodle cookies, a nervous peace offering. Emily was stunning. Impeccably dressed in a tailored red dress, hair and makeup flawless, she exuded an effortless confidence that filled the room before she even spoke. Her handshake was firm, her smile polite but distant. "Mrs. Grant," she said smoothly. "So nice to finally meet you." Helen, in her plain wool sweater and sensible shoes, felt painfully out of place among the polished chrome and glass of the restaurant. She smiled anyway, offering the tin of cookies with a trembling hand. "I thought you might enjoy these."
Michael usait tout of them.
Emily accepted the gift with a nod, setting it aside like one might set aside an unwanted catalogue. The dinner was polite, stilted. Michael, to Helen's heartbreak, seemed different, tense, impatient, constantly checking his phone. He spoke about job offers, potential investments, Emily's networking prowess. He barely mentioned Cedarville, or their home, or anything that once tethered him to the life Helen had built for him. When the check arrived, Michael hastily covered it, brushing off Helen's protests. "It's fine, Mom," he said, almost annoyed. "You don't need to worry about that stuff anymore." On the drive back to her motel, Helen stared out the window, blinking against the sting in her eyes. She had raised Michael to be independent, but she had never anticipated this, a son who now seemed almost ashamed of the simplicity, the smallness of the life she had given him. In early spring, Michael called with news. "We're getting married," he said, voice bright, eager. Helen clutched the phone tighter. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, meaning it with all her heart.
"When is the big day?"
"July," Michael replied. "It's going to be a big wedding. Emily's family knows a lot of people." There was a beat of silence before he added, almost as an afterthought, "We'll send you the details." "Send you the details. Not we need you here, not we can't wait to celebrate with you, but we'll send you the details, like a customer awaiting an appointment confirmation." Helen smiled into the silence, even as her heart fractured just a little more. Over the next few months, she sewed a dress for the occasion, a simple navy blue gown with tiny embroidered flowers along the hem. She practiced her smiles in the mirror, willing herself to be happy, to be invisible if needed. This day was about Michael. About his future. Her place was to watch, to clap, to fade into the background. The wedding was held in an opulent hall on the lakeshore. Hundreds of guests milled about in designer suits and glittering gowns. Helen stood quietly near the back, feeling like a ghost in her homemade dress. Michael looked dashing in his tuxedo. Emily was radiant. Together, they were the picture of young ambition, a perfect match crafted for society pages and Christmas cards. Helen watched as they danced their first dance, as Emily's father gave a toast that barely mentioned Michael's upbringing, as Emily's mother accepted congratulations for raising such a fine young woman. No one mentioned Helen. No one asked where the boy had come from, how he had been saved from a stormy night on the church steps. Helen clapped politely, smiled until her cheeks hurt, swallowed the lump in her throat. Later, when the party spilled onto the lakeside terrace, Michael found her. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, kissing her cheek perfunctorily. Helen touched his arm, trying to hold on to him for a second longer. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. He smiled, distracted, already scanning the crowd for someone else. And just like that, he slipped away into the glittering night. Helen stood alone, the breeze from the lake lifting the hem of her simple dress, carrying it like a sigh into the darkness. She stayed a little while longer, long enough to finish her glass of lemonade, long enough to memorize the way Michael laughed with Emily's friends, long enough to understand that the boy she had loved with every fiber of her being had built himself a new life, one where she no longer quite fit. And then, when she was sure no one would notice, Helen quietly gathered her things and left. No one stopped her. No one saw her go. In the months following the wedding, Helen returned to Cedarville and to the life she had carefully pieced together over 2 decades. Nothing had changed in the small town.
The church bell still rang every Sunday morning.
The grocery store still stocked the same brands on the same creaky shelves. Children still rode their bikes past her house, their laughter pealing into the open sky. And yet, everything inside Helen felt irrevocably altered. Michael called less frequently now. The conversations, when they happened, were brief, polite, efficient, updates about job interviews, networking events, plans for the future. Rarely did he ask about Helen's health, her garden, her quiet, unchanging life. The bond that had once been unbreakable, built on bedtime stories and scraped knees and whispered dreams, now felt frayed thin, strained to the point of snapping. Still, Helen clung to it with quiet desperation. She told herself it was a phase. Newlyweds were busy. Young people were ambitious. Michael was building a life, and she should be proud. And yet when she sat at her kitchen table in the evenings, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the silent phone, the ache in her chest said otherwise. It was late autumn when the first request came. Michael called one evening, his voice unusually hesitant. "Mom," he said, "Emily and I are thinking about buying a condo. It's a great investment.
Downtown, close to my hospital.
But well, the down payment is steep." Helen gripped the phone tighter. "Of course, sweetheart," she said without hesitation. "How much do you need?" He named a figure that made her stomach clench. It would mean cashing in one of the smaller certificates she had tucked away, a part of the fortune she had promised herself she would never touch, except for emergencies. Was this an emergency? Maybe not by the old standards. But to Helen, helping Michael was always urgent, always necessary. She sent the money the next morning, along with a card wishing them happiness in their new home. There was no thank you call, no note. Only a text from Michael 2 weeks later, a blurry photo of him and Emily grinning in front of a sleek glass building. "Moved in," the caption read. Helen smiled, even as tears blurred her vision. Christmas that year came and went without a visit. Michael and Emily were too busy, caught up in work, social events, and decorating their new condo. Helen mailed a carefully wrapped package, a hand-knitted blanket and a set of antique silver spoons, but received only a curt message from Emily in return: "Thanks. Very thoughtful." Spring brought another request. This time, it was for Emily. "She's getting her teeth straightened," Michael explained on a rushed call. "Cosmetic stuff. Insurance won't cover it. It's important for her job image." Helen didn't hesitate. She dipped into her savings again. She reasoned that it wasn't about vanity. It was about supporting Michael's future, about helping him build a life he deserved. By the end of the year, Helen had liquidated almost all her small investments, the ones she had once imagined using to repair the roof, to visit the Grand Canyon, to buy a new stove. She lived even more frugally now, clipping coupons, turning down the thermostat, taking in extra sewing work from neighbors. But none of that mattered, she told herself, as long as Michael was happy.
And then, on a scié marche afternoon, the real blow came.
Helen had been sick for several days, a persistent cough, fever, aching joints. Too weak to drive herself to the clinic, she called Michael, her voice hoarse with fatigue. "Sweetheart," she said, "I'm not feeling well. Would you mind coming for a weekend? Just for a day, even." There was a pause. "Mom," Michael said, and there was something brittle in his voice, something defensive. "Emily and I are slammed. We've got work, meetings, deadlines. You know how it is." "I understand," Helen said softly, even though she didn't. After she hung up, she sat alone at her kitchen table, listening to the hum of the empty house. That night, as the fever raged and the walls of her small home seemed to press closer around her, Helen realized something with a clarity that cut through the fog of illness and loneliness.
Michael was gone.
Not physically. His name still appeared on her caller ID. His face still smiled from framed photos on the mantel. But the boy who had clung to her hand during thunderstorms, who had whispered "I love you, Mom" against her shoulder after nightmares, had slipped away somewhere between ambition and approval, between the bright lights of the city and the shadows they left behind. The next few months passed in a blur of silence and resignation. Helen healed, but something inside her remained wounded. She still sent birthday cards, still forwarded clippings she thought might interest him. Sometimes he replied. Most times he didn't.
The final break came one muggy July evening.
Helen decided, on a whim, to surprise Michael and Emily with a visit. She baked a batch of apple pies, packed a basket with homemade jams and fresh-picked flowers, and boarded the Greyhound bus to Chicago. She imagined their faces lighting up at the sight of her. She imagined laughter, hugs, maybe a meal together. When she knocked on the door of their gleaming new condo, it was Emily who answered. Her smile was tight, brittle. "Helen," she said, blocking the doorway slightly. "You should have called first." Helen held out the basket, suddenly unsure. I just thought, maybe we could have dinner. Emily hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly. Michael appeared from the living room, a strained smile on his face. Mom, he said, this isn't a good time. We're getting ready for a trip. Helen nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Of course, she said. I just wanted to see you. Michael exchanged a glance with Emily, then said, almost apologetically,
Maybe you should head back tonight.
It'll be easier. He said it so casually, as if suggesting a change in dinner plans rather than dismissing the woman who had once given up everything for him. Helen nodded again, mechanically. She placed the basket on the console table, turned, and left. No one offered her a ride to the bus station. She sat alone on the hard bench at the terminal, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as the city lights blurred and wavered beyond the glass. When the bus finally rumbled away from Chicago, Helen stared out at the endless darkness, her reflection faint in the window.
Sommière, deep inside, a door creaked shut.
She didn't cry. She simply let go. And this time, she didn't look back. After that night, Helen withdrew. She no longer called Michael. She no longer sent packages or birthday cards. She no longer sat by the kitchen phone, waiting for a ring that might never come. She moved through her days with a quiet, measured grace, as if each step was a small act of reclaiming herself. The neighbors in Cedarville noticed the change but said nothing. Helen still attended Sunday service, still smiled politely at the market, still baked her pies. But the light in her eyes, the subtle joy that had once warmed her every word, was gone. Winter came early that year, coating the town in layers of frost and silence. Helen bundled herself in thick sweaters, lit fires in the old stone hearth, and began sorting through her life. She sold the house, the modest little cottage where she had poured 2 decades of love and hope. She donated most of her belongings to the local church, the mismatched china, the hand-sewn quilts, the photo albums she couldn't bear to look through anymore. When the real estate agent asked for a forwarding address, Helen simply smiled and said, I'll be in touch. She wasn't planning to leave a trail. She withdrew the remaining money from her local bank account, the pennies she had scraped together through years of labor and sacrifice. The rest, the fortune that had slept untouched for so long in her anonymous trust fund, she finally called upon. Helen Grant, once a forgotten figure in a forgotten town, quietly reclaimed her name, her identity, her power. She booked a one-way flight to Florida, a state she had never visited but had always imagined as warm and forgiving. When she boarded the plane, carrying only a small suitcase and a battered leather satchel, no one at the Cedarville terminal recognized her. She might as well have been a ghost, slipping through the cracks of a town that had long since stopped seeing her.
The plane lifted into the cold winter sky, cutting through the clouds like a blade.
Helen did not look back. She landed in Sarasota on a bright, humid afternoon. The air smelled of salt and blooming jasmine. She breathed it in deeply, feeling the weight of her old life begin to lift from her shoulders. She rented a small cottage near the bay, a cheerful place with whitewashed walls, a screened porch, and a garden full of hibiscus. The owner, a kindly woman named Mrs. Allen, asked few questions and accepted Helen's cash payment without comment. Helen introduced herself as Helen Deemer, a nod to her grandmother's maiden name. She wasn't running from anything, she told herself. She was simply choosing what parts of her past to carry forward and what parts to leave behind. She furnished the cottage sparingly, a wooden table, a soft armchair, a sturdy bed. On the walls, she hung her own paintings, landscapes and seascapes she had begun creating in the long quiet nights after Michael left. Art had always been a private sanctuary for Helen, a place where sorrow could be poured out in brushstrokes and colors. Now, it became her new vocation. She sold a few pieces at the local Saturday market, then a few more at the downtown art fair.
Word spread.
Soon, a small gallery offered to host a showing of her work. Helen Deemer, the woman no one in Cedarville would have recognized, became a quiet sensation in Sarasota's modest art community. She never bragged, never sought fame. She simply painted, lived, and slowly healed. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Michael and Emily faced a storm of their own making. Without Helen's silent financial support, their world began to crack. The downtown condo, so proudly purchased, became a burden as mortgage payments piled up. Emily's job, reliant on image and connections, grew precarious. Michael, still in his residency, struggled with mounting debt and impossible hours. Tension seeped into their marriage. Arguments, once rare, became nightly occurrences. "You said your mom would help." Emily snapped one evening, her voice sharp enough to cut. Michael rubbed his temples, exhausted. "I can't make her send money.
She's gone."
Gone. The word hung between them, heavy and accusing. Gone was the woman who had patched every hole, who had caught every fall, who had answered every call for help. Gone because they had taught her she was not needed, not wanted, not enough. Michael tried calling her, then emailing, then even writing a letter. All were met with silence. He drove back to Cedarville one desperate weekend, only to find the cottage sold, the garden overgrown, the mailbox stuffed with advertisements. The neighbors shrugged when he asked. "She left months ago," one woman said. "Didn't leave a forwarding address." Standing in the driveway of the empty cottage, Michael felt a hollow ache open inside him. He thought about the nights she had stayed up sewing Halloween costumes, the mornings she had packed his lunch with handwritten notes tucked inside. He thought about the calluses on her hands, the lines on her face, the quiet, unshakable way she had loved him. And he realized, too late, that he had been rich in ways he never understood until he was poor beyond repair. By spring, Michael's marriage had crumbled. Emily left, taking what little remained of their savings with her. Michael moved into a cheap apartment near the hospital, a place with peeling paint and flickering lights. Sometimes, late at night, after another grueling shift, he would sit by the window, staring at the empty skyline, and wonder where Helen was. Was she still alive? Was she angry? Did she miss him? Did she think about him at all? The silence from her end was louder than any scream he could imagine. Meanwhile, Helen thrived. She took long walks on the beach every morning, feeling the sun warm her skin, the salt tangling in her silver hair. She sipped coffee on her porch, listening to the distant sound of waves and gulls. She painted, she wrote in her journals, she learned to laugh again. She made friends, real friends, people who knew her as Helen Deemer, the artist, the neighbor, the woman who loved stray cats and always brought the best pecan pie to community potlucks. She told no one about Cedarville. About Michael. About the life she had left behind. It was not denial. It was acceptance. She understood now, love, given without respect, became a chain. Love, when taken for granted, became a weapon. She had chosen freedom. And she had chosen it without bitterness.
One evening, sitting under a sky ablaze with star, Hélène closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. Not for revenge.
Not for regret. But for release. Wherever Michael was, she hoped he found peace. As for her, she was already living it. Months passed, and the seasons shifted again. In Sarasota, Helen continued to live simply, fully, quietly. Her art flourished, she hosted small exhibitions, participated in charity auctions, and even taught weekend painting classes to eager retirees and children alike. People loved her not because they knew her story, they didn't, but because she carried a rare gentleness, a dignity that seemed to belong to a different era. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Michael was unraveling. After Emily's departure, the financial burden that had been straining at the seams finally tore apart. His credit cards maxed out. His car was repossessed. His reputation at the hospital suffered as fatigue and bitterness poisoned his once promising career. When the eviction notice arrived, Michael had nowhere to go. He slept on a colleague's couch for a few weeks, then in a rundown hostel where peeling wallpaper and broken windows made the cold seep into his very bones. He thought often of Cedarville. Of the small, cozy home he had once hated for its simplicity. Of the woman who had given him everything and asked for so little in return. Guilt gnawed at him in sleepless nights. He searched online, desperately trying to track her down. But Helen Grant had vanished without a trace. No address, no phone number, no email. She had become a ghost, and Michael had no idea how to call her back. In his desperation, Michael turned to the one place he knew had a megaphone loud enough to reach anyone, the internet. He created a social media account, posted a tearful video, and titled it "Searching for My Missing Mother." In the video, he painted a heart-wrenching picture, a devoted son, abandoned by the only family he ever knew. A young man left to struggle alone while his elderly mother disappeared into the void. Tears streamed down his face as he pleaded, "If anyone knows where Helen Grant is, please tell her son is looking for her.
Tell her he love her.
Tell her I'm sorry." The video went viral almost overnight. People shared it by the thousands. Hashtags trended. News outlets picked up the story, calling it the son's heartbreaking search for his lost mother. Donations flooded in. Messages of support poured into his inbox. Strangers called him brave, noble, heartbroken. But Helen saw the video too. One evening, as she sipped chamomile tea on her porch, her neighbor Mrs. Allen knocked gently on the screen door, a worried look on her face. "You might want to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Helen watched the video in silence, her face unreadable. When it ended, she handed the tablet back without a word, her hands steady. That night, she sat in her small living room, the moonlight slanting across the wooden floors, and thought long and hard. Michael had not looked for her because he missed her. He had not searched because he wanted to right the wrongs. He had sought her out because he needed her again, or rather, needed the comfort, the safety, the resources she once provided. Even now, he wore the mask of the victim to the world, crafting a narrative where he was the wronged party, the abandoned child, the betrayed son. Not once, in all the tears and trembling words, had he admitted his own betrayal. Helen felt no anger as she realized this.
Only a deep, sorrowful clarity.
Love had to be a two-way bridge. And Michael had burned his side to the ground. The world clamored for a happy reunion, a tearful forgiveness captured on viral video for millions to consume. But Helen knew that real life was not a fairy tale scripted for ratings. Real life was the cold bench at a bus station. Real life was an unopened basket of pies wilting on a console table. Real life was a mother learning, at long last, to save herself. The next morning, Helen called her lawyer. "I want to make everything official," she said.
Every asset. Every document. Every last thread.
"Are you sure?" he asked gently. "Absolutely," she replied. By the end of the week, every piece of Helen's financial estate was locked under the name Helen Deemer. New wills were signed.
Trust updated.
Beneficiaries chosen, small charities, educational funds, animal shelters, but not Michael. She left nothing ambiguous.
No loophole. No open doors.
She would not allow the love she had once given freely to be turned into a commodity for someone else's convenience. Meanwhile, the media frenzy continued to build. Talk shows debated her disappearance. Online forums speculated wildly about why a mother would leave her child. Some blamed her. Some blamed Michael. Few saw the truth buried under layers of expectation and fantasy. Helen stayed silent. Her friends in Sarasota, unaware of her past, shielded her without even realizing it. They spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her art. To them, she was simply Helen, not a missing mother, not a scandal, not a ghost. And that, Helen realized, was all she had ever wanted. Freedom to be herself. Unchained by old debts, old guilts, old illusions. One evening, as she walked along the beach, the sky awash in lavender and gold, Helen paused to watch a group of children building sandcastles near the surf. They laughed, shouted, dug furiously with plastic shovels, their faces alight with pure, unfiltered joy. Helen smiled, feeling the breeze tug at her hair, the cool sand between her toes. Life went on. Love, in its purest form, still existed. It just had to be placed where it could bloom, not where it would be trampled. She picked up a small shell, a spiral, pink and perfect, and slipped it into her pocket. A souvenir, not of what she had lost, but of what she had reclaimed. Her own life. Her own name.
Her own peace. Behind her, the tide washed away the footprint in the sand.
Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and shimmering, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. And this time, Helen walked toward it without hesitation. In Chicago, Michael's life continued its slow, inexorable collapse. The donations he had received from the viral video began to dry up as new tragedies and fresh faces demanded the public's fleeting attention. Sympathy had a short half-life, he realized bitterly, especially when accompanied by growing whispers of skepticism. Some online users started digging into his story. Inconsistencies appeared. Photos from his lavish wedding. Posts bragging about the downtown condo. A LinkedIn profile boasting about his lucrative job offers. The tide turned swiftly and mercilessly. Comments once filled with prayers and encouragement now brimmed with suspicion and anger. Maybe she left for a reason. Looks like someone enjoyed her money but not her company.
Craille me arriver, spoilet de bras.
Within weeks, Michael's social media accounts were flooded with accusations. His modest attempt to monetize his journey through brand sponsorships collapsed overnight. Companies pulled out. Followers unfollowed. Supporters disappeared. Without pity or profit, Michael was left with what he had always been running from, himself. Job opportunities dried up as employers Googled his name. His application for a small apartment was rejected after a background check. Friends, or at least the ones he thought were friends, stopped returning his calls. Desperation set in. For the first time in his adult life, Michael truly understood what it meant to be alone. Not the kind of loneliness cured by noise or distraction. The kind that sits in your bones, heavy and relentless, whispering every failure into your ear. Late at night, huddled under a threadbare blanket in the corner of a shelter, Michael replayed his memories, searching for where it had all gone wrong. He remembered Helen's hands, rough but gentle, as she tied his shoelaces on his first day of school. He remembered her voice, cracking with pride, when he got his acceptance letter from college. He remembered her standing at his wedding, alone, unnoticed, wearing a simple homemade dress while the rest of the guests sparkled. He remembered, far too late, the weight of every sacrifice she had made so that he could rise. And how carelessly he had discarded her once he thought he had outgrown her love.
One rainy morning, Michael made a decision.
He would find her. Not to beg for money. Not to patch together a crumbling reputation. But because he owed her something no amount of tears or donations could buy, the truth. He owed her an apology. Real, unvarnished, and spoken face to face. The search was harder than he anticipated. Helen had left no trace, no forwarding address, no open social media, no banking information under her old name. Michael scoured online databases, called former neighbors, reached out to old acquaintances. Most had nothing to offer. A few had vague rumors. I heard she went south, one woman at the Cedarville grocery store said.
Meb Florida, murmure Nazer, shrugging.
Michael spent what little money he had left on a bus ticket heading south. He slept sitting up, pressed against greasy windows, the rhythmic hum of the wheels lulling him into feverish dreams. In every dream Helen appeared, not angry, not accusatory, but simply looking at him with the same steady eyes she had always carried. And in every dream, Michael woke with the taste of regret bitter on his tongue. When he finally reached Florida, he had no plan. He wandered from town to town, asking questions no one could answer. Days blurred into weeks. His clothes wore thin. His shoes split at the seams. He grew gaunt, hollow-eyed, a shadow of the man who had once stood tall at a glittering wedding reception. And still, no sign of her. In Sarasota, Helen continued to paint. She had heard, through the careful whispers of her community, that a disheveled young man was wandering through town asking about an artist named Helen. She knew it was Michael. She knew he was close. But she did not change her routine. She painted in the mornings.
She walked the beach at sunset.
She sipped tea on her porch and listened to the hum of cicadas. She had made peace with her past. She would not let it reclaim her. One evening, as she sat in the open-air cafe where she sometimes sketched passers-by for fun, Helen felt a familiar presence before she saw him. Michael stood at the edge of the patio, clothes damp from a sudden summer rain, hair plastered to his forehead, shoes leaving muddy prints on the brick floor. He looked thinner, older, defeated. He spotted her instantly. Their eyes met. Helen set down her pencil and waited. Michael approached slowly, each step hesitant, like a child approaching a wild animal. He stopped a few feet away, unable to speak. Helen waited. The cafe murmured around them, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, but in their bubble of silence, every heartbeat was deafening. Finally, Michael found his voice, hoarse and broken. "Mom," he said. Helen tilted her head slightly.
You look tired, she said softly. Michael looked, a shocked, ugly sound.
"I'm sorry," he blurted out. "I'm so sorry." Tears welled in his eyes, but he did not move closer. Helen regarded him carefully. "I know," she said.
Michael's face crumpled.
"I didn't understand," he said. "I didn't see what you did for me."
He tugged.
"I thought there would always be more time." Helen nodded. "Time runs out," she said gently. "And sometimes when we waste it, we don't get it back. Michael fell to his knees, right there on the wet bricks, heedless of the stares around them. I don't want money, he said desperately.
I don't want anything.
I just want a chance to make it right. Helen's heart ached. Not with anger. Not with triumph. With sorrow. Because some things, once broken, could not be mended. Not fully. Not cleanly. She rose slowly from her chair and knelt down beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, light, fleeting.
I forgive you, she whispered.
But forgiveness does not mean returning to what was.
Michael sobbed, shoulder shaking.
Helen squeezed his shoulder gently, then stood. You have your life, she said. Find a way to live it well. Michael looked up, anguish etched into every line of his face.
Will you ever see you again? Helen smiled, a sad, beautiful smile.
You will, she said.
In every good thing you do.
Then without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving muddy footprints mingling with his in the rain. Michael remained kneeling long after she disappeared from view, the storm clouds rolling overhead, the taste of salt and regret on his tongue. And somewhere inside him, something small and broken began, slowly, painfully, to heal. Michael stayed on his knees long after Helen had gone, the warm rain soaking into his clothes, blurring the world around him into a misty watercolor of sorrow and realization. Eventually, a cafe worker gently touched his shoulder and whispered that he needed to move along. He nodded mutely, rose on unsteady legs, and wandered into the wet streets of Sarasota without any clear direction. For the first time in his life, Michael understood that not every mistake could be undone. Some wounds didn't heal because forgiveness had been offered, they healed only when those who caused them chose to change, truly, deeply, without expectation of reward. Helen had given him the gift of closure, but she had also given him something far more precious, the permission to move on, without dragging her down in the process. It was now up to him what kind of man he would become. Michael found a small motel room near the outskirts of town, the kind with peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign that buzzed through the humid nights. He paid for a week with the last of his cash and set about piecing together a plan. He needed work. He needed to rebuild. He needed, above all else, to become someone worthy of the love he had once been given so freely. He started small. A diner on Main Street hung a help-wanted sign in the window. Michael walked in, head bowed, and asked if they needed a dishwasher. The owner, a woman named Ruth with a sharp voice and kind eyes, looked him over and said, "You know how to show up on time?" "I do," Michael said. "Good enough," Ruth said, tossing him an apron. "Start tomorrow." The work was brutal, long hours on his feet, hands raw from hot water and soap, the air heavy with the sense of bacon grease and burned coffee. But Michael threw himself into it with a kind of grim determination. At night, he collapsed onto the thin motel mattress, his muscles aching, his mind teetering between exhaustion and a strange, fragile sense of pride. He wasn't saving lives. He wasn't winning awards. He wasn't building wealth. He was simply showing up. And for now, that was enough. In his free hours, Michael visited the local library. He checked out books on financial literacy, small business management, even self-help volumes that once would have made him roll his eyes. He filled notebooks with ideas, goals, reflections. Bit by bit, he began to imagine a different future. Not the glittering skyline of Chicago, not the designer suits and high-powered networking events.
A quieter life. A smaller life.
But one rooted in truth, in hard work, in gratitude. Michael also began volunteering at a local shelter, washing dishes and folding laundry. The clients were a mix of runaways, battered women, veterans who had slipped through society's cracks. He didn't tell them his story. He didn't tell them anything at all, really. He just worked, listened, showed up. In the faces of those he helped, Michael began to understand something that had once eluded him. Service was not about grand gestures or public applause. It was about small kindnesses, offered without expectation. He thought often of Helen. He wondered if she knew he was still here, rebuilding himself in the quiet corners of the town she had chosen as her sanctuary. He wondered if she ever walked past the diner and glimpsed him scrubbing plates through the steamed-up windows. He wondered, and he hoped, but he never sought her out again. He had made his apology. She had given her answer. Now it was time to let her be free, and to build something worthy from the ruins of his choices. Months slipped by.
Summer faded into the crisp, golden light of autumn.
Michael saved every dollar he could, living on canned soup and second-hand clothes. Slowly, painfully, he clawed his way back to stability. Ruth, seeing his dedication, promoted him to line cook. The shelter director offered him a small stipend to help organize their food pantry. He found a studio apartment, a single room with a sink and a squeaky bed, and moved out of the motel. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. But it was his. One evening, after closing time at the diner, Ruth sat down across from him with 2 mugs of coffee. "You're a hard worker," she said. "Not many stick around like you." "Had to learn the hard way," Michael said, smiling ruefully. Ruth studied him for a long moment. "You ever think about going back to school?" she asked.
Michael loguait under his brise.
"I don't know if I deserve that." "It's not about deserving," Ruth said, tapping her mug against his. "It's about what you build next." That night, Michael lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, Ruth's words echoing in his mind.
What you build next?
He got up, pulled out one of his battered notebooks, and wrote down a single sentence. "It's never too late to become someone new." The next morning, he enrolled in evening classes at the community college, basic courses in health sciences, nursing, patient care. He wasn't chasing prestige anymore. He wasn't chasing a title. He simply wanted to be useful. Useful, the way Helen had been. Quietly, steadfastly, without fanfare. He wanted to make his life a thank you to her, written not in words but in actions. One evening, walking home from his class, Michael passed by the small community art gallery near the waterfront. A sign in the window caught his eye. New exhibition, The Tides Within, works by Helen Deemer. He froze. He hadn't known Helen was still painting. He hadn't known she had shared her work with the world. A powerful longing welled up inside him, but he did not step inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket, staring at the delicate watercolors visible through the glass, soft landscapes, waves crashing against lonely shores, sunsets melting into the sea. They were beautiful, strong, free.
Just like her.
Michael smiled, a real, unforced smile. He whispered into the cool night air, not expecting anyone to hear. "Thank you, Mom." Then he turned away, walking back toward his small apartment, his books, his dreams. There was work to be done. And for the first time in a very long time, Michael was ready to do it. As autumn deepened, Michael's life took on a rhythm of purpose and humility. Mornings at the diner, afternoons at the shelter, evenings spent buried in textbooks under the flickering light of his small desk lamp. His days were exhausting but honest, stitched together by effort and quiet victories. Every week he crossed off small goals in his battered notebook. Finish a new chapter in anatomy. Volunteer an extra shift at the shelter. Save enough for next semester's tuition. The goals were modest, the celebrations solitary. But for the first time, Michael felt himself growing into someone he could respect. Sundays became sacred. He would rise early, walk to the bay, and sit for hours on the old wooden bench overlooking the water. Sometimes he brought a sandwich. Sometimes just a thermos of coffee. He never brought a phone. He never brought noise. He simply sat, listened to the waves, and let the silence do its quiet work inside him. He often thought of Helen during those long golden afternoons. Not with the gnawing regret that once consumed him, but with a softer kind of ache, the ache of deep gratitude mixed with mourning. He imagined her somewhere not far away, living her life the way she deserved, free, peaceful, surrounded by beauty. He didn't need to find her again. He didn't need to force a reunion. Loving someone, he realized, sometimes meant letting them go, truly letting them live without the weight of your needs pulling them backward. Meanwhile, Helen flourished quietly in her own world. The success of her gallery show had surprised her. She had sold several paintings, enough to make her financially comfortable without touching her old investments. But she didn't paint for profit. She painted because the act itself mended parts of her soul that had long gone untended. She, too, had built a new routine.
Morning walks by the beach.
Painting sessions in the sun-drenched back room of her cottage. Potluck dinners with friends who knew her only as Helen Deemer, artist and neighbor. Sometimes she caught whispers of the young man who volunteered at the shelter, who worked tirelessly at the diner, who walked the same bay paths she loved. She never approached him. She never interfered. Love, she knew, sometimes meant staying invisible so that growth could happen without shame. Helen attended his first community art show in secret. She stood at the back unnoticed as Michael displayed a few simple sketches, nothing grand, just scenes of everyday life, a mother tying a boy's shoes, an old woman feeding seagulls, a pair of calloused hands mending a fishing net. The drawings were rough but heartfelt. They spoke of noticing small moments, of seeing beauty where once he might have seen only inconvenience. Helen wiped away a tear and slipped out before the event ended. She did not need to speak to him. His work told her everything she needed to know.
Winter came again.
In Florida, it was less a season and more a soft cooling of the air, a gentler sun. Michael saved enough money to move into a slightly better apartment, still small, still modest, but with a view of the water if he leaned out the balcony at just the right angle. He continued his studies, enrolling part-time in a nursing assistant certification program. It wasn't the dream of a white-coated doctor he had once chased, but it was work that mattered. Work that healed. On Christmas Eve, Michael attended the shelter's annual dinner, helping serve turkey and mashed potatoes to lines of weary faces. He wore a donated sweater too large for his thin frame. He smiled and wished every person he served a Merry Christmas. As the evening wound down, the shelter director handed him a small envelope. From an anonymous donor, she said, winking. Inside was a single card. No money. No grand gesture.
Just a simple watercolor painting of a shell, pink, spiraled, resting on a patch of golden sand.
And one handwritten sentence.
Keep walking forward.
You are not alone. Michael pressed the card to his chest, overcome. He knew, without a doubt, who had sent it. He didn't need more. The following months passed in a blur of steady effort. Michael graduated from his certification program and was hired as a nursing assistant at a small community clinic. His duties were simple: checking vital signs, comforting anxious patients, cleaning wounds, holding hands during hard moments. He was not saving the world. But he was helping people heal, sometimes in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. He became known at the clinic for his kindness, his patience, his willingness to listen. Old women with trembling hands smiled when they saw him approaching. Children with scrapes and fevers clutched his fingers, soothed by his calm presence. Veterans struggling with old ghosts found comfort in his silent, steady support. And Michael, every day, quietly honored Helen. Not with monuments. Not with speeches. But with small acts of goodness stitched into the fabric of ordinary days. Helen, from her distance, continued to watch without intruding. She saw the way the townspeople spoke his name with affection. She saw the small write-up in the local newspaper, local volunteer honored for community service. She saw, and she let him walk his own path. It was enough. One evening, months later, Michael sat on his modest balcony, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, the base shimmering under the setting sun. He pulled out a notebook, not the battered one he used for goals and budgets, but a fresh one, clean and crisp. At the top of the first page, he wrote, "What I owe the world." And beneath it, in smaller letters, kindness, effort, gratitude. He closed the notebook, tucked it under his arm, and smiled into the fading light. Life wasn't about erasing mistakes. It wasn't about begging for forgiveness forever. It was about choosing every day to build something better from the pieces of who you used to be. Michael wasn't perfect. He never would be. But he was trying. And sometimes he thought, trying was the greatest act of love he could offer, to Helen, to the world, and most of all to the man he was becoming. Spring unfurled across Sarasota with a slow, deliberate grace. The air smelled of salt and magnolia. The days stretched longer, warm and golden, and the town seemed to breathe easier with the arrival of new light. Michael's life, too, unfurled in quiet, deliberate steps. He continued his work at the community clinic, slowly gaining trust and respect among his colleagues and patients. He moved into a slightly larger apartment, still modest, but filled with small tokens of the life he was carefully, lovingly building. Books stacked by the window.
A secondant guitare leaning against the wall.
A pot of marigolds on the balcony, bright and stubborn. He lived simply. He lived honestly. And for the first time in years, he lived without the gnawing need to prove anything to anyone. Meanwhile, Helen continued her quiet existence not far away. She still painted, though less for galleries and more for herself. Landscapes. Skyscapes. Small moments of everyday beauty, a child chasing gulls, an old man repairing a boat, a young nurse kneeling to tie an elderly woman's shoe. Each brushstroke was a prayer.
Attends-you. Allez go.
One afternoon, Helen received an invitation in the mail. It was a simple white card, no return address, no fanfare. Inside, in Michael's careful handwriting, the community clinic is hosting an open house and art show to raise funds for new medical equipment. Some of my sketches will be there. If you happen to be free, I'd love for you to see what I've been working on. No pressure.
No expectation.
Just gratitude. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the invitation trembling slightly in her hands. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, a smile lined with sorrow, with pride, with the complex ache of motherhood that never truly faded. She thought long and hard before making her decision. And then, on a soft April evening, she dressed in a simple linen dress, pinned a small shell-shaped brooch to her collar, and made her way to the clinic. The event was small, modest. Folding chairs lined the parking lot. String lights hung between the lampposts. A makeshift stage had been set up near the entrance, where children played guitars and sang off-key folk songs. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't polished. It was beautiful. Helen moved quietly among the displays. Local artists had contributed paintings, photographs, crafts. Children's drawings fluttered from clotheslines strung between trees. Michael's table stood near the center. Simple sketches, like the ones she had glimpsed months earlier. But these were different somehow. Sharper. Deeper. One sketch showed a woman standing alone at a bus station, a small suitcase at her feet, her face turned away but her posture strong. Another depicted two hands, one older, worn with wrinkles, one younger, reaching back but never quite touching. And the last, a simple watercolor, showed a bay at sunset, a single figure walking the shoreline, leaving footprints that the tide would soon wash away. Helen stood in front of that last painting for a long time. She felt, rather than saw, Michael approach. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood beside her, hands in his pockets, heart in his throat. Finally he spoke, voice low and steady. I wasn't sure you'd come. Helen smiled softly. I wasn't sure either, she said. They stood in silence, watching the watercolor world before them. I know I can't change the past, Michael said finally. And I'm not here to ask for anything. I want you to know that everything I do now, every good thing, is because of what you taught me. Even when I was too blind to see it. Helen reached out, touched his arm gently. You found your way, she said. That's all any mother could hope for. Michael blinked rapidly, fighting the sting behind his eyes. I still miss you, he whispered. Helen squeezed his arm once, firmly, then let go. I'm always with you, she said. Not in the ways you might want, but in the ways you need. He nodded, unable to speak. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They didn't make grand promises. They simply stood together for a few more moments, two souls who had been broken, mended, and broken again, and who had chosen, each in their own way, to keep moving forward. When Helen finally turned to leave, Michael didn't follow. He watched her walk across the parking lot, small and steady, her dress rippling in the evening breeze. He smiled, a deep, true smile, and turned back to his table. There was still work to be done. Later that night, Helen sat on her porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. She stared out at the stars scattered across the velvet sky, feeling a peace settle in her chest. Michael would be all right. She had done her part. She had loved him fiercely, flawedly, completely. She had let him go when she needed to. She had forgiven, not because he had earned it, but because she had chosen to free herself from the weight of resentment. Forgiveness, she had learned, was never about forgetting. It was about choosing yourself, your peace, your future. And sometimes, in rare and unexpected moments, it was about seeing the people you loved find their own way home, not to you, but to themselves. Helen closed her eyes and whispered a simple prayer into the night. Thank you for the journey. Thank you for the lessons. Thank you for the love, in all its forms, in all its imperfect glory. The breeze stirred the chimes on her porch, and for a moment, it sounded like laughter. Soft. Free. Helen smiled, cradling the warmth of it deep inside her heart. Tomorrow, she would paint again. Tomorrow, she would walk the beach. Tomorrow she would live, not as a mother forgotten or a woman abandoned, but as herself. Whole, strong, free. And somewhere not far away, Michael would do the same. In his own way. At his own pace. Carrying the pieces of their story not as burdens, but as blessings. Because in the end, love, real love, was never wasted. It simply changed form. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to let it, it could become something even stronger than before. It could become hope.